You're listening to the Onside Podcast, the podcast for innovation-driven entrepreneurship here in Atlantic Canada. I'm your host, Alex McCann, and this is Season 2, Episode 19. And in this episode, we're taking a look at climate adaptive technology and how it's enabling communities. Our guest today is Matt Mizzi, founder and CEO of Drinkable, the world's first accurate, affordable, and easy-to-use handheld water testing device. Matt has a degree in environmental science from Acadia University. He's a venture capital enthusiast, and Drinkable is the winner of the Bio-Innovation Challenge. All right, Matt, thanks so much for joining us here on the Onside Podcast. Welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be here, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Okay, awesome. Well, we'd love for you to share a little bit about your background, who you are, and who is Matt Mizzi.
Matt Mizzi is an environmental scientist by education. Born and raised by a engineer turned CEO. So I had some blueprints to follow there. And I got entangled in the world of venture capital through a competition at my school. And then that led to me actually getting a job as a research analyst for a managed fundraising firm, doing Series A investment raising for medtech companies in Toronto. Did that for about 6 months and determined that I wanted to leverage my environmental science education with my venture capital learnings and go out and gather money to work on the most pressing problems from an environmental science perspective.
Okay. That sounds like a really interesting background with a lot of, I would say, twists and turns. So science, VC, investing. And so your company is called Drinkable. How did you get around to creating Drinkable as a company, and what does Drinkable do?
Well, Drinkable is creating a handheld device, and we like to call it the world's first easy-to-use, affordable, and accurate water testing device for consumers. So the idea there is we're going to take really advanced technology and pare down the use case of that technology below technicians, which is usually what testing equipment is designed for, so that it's a button press. We stabilize the water automatically. We test for all the appropriate analytes that you should be concerned about, as opposed to getting the consumer to figure that out. And it's semi-reusable, so it's got a consumable cartridge, but you can reuse the device over and over again, which makes the testing process much less painful. And that's especially pertinent in our target market, which is well users, because they're supposed to be testing every 6 months to a year, and almost no one tests because of the obstacles involved. So we're trying to fix that.
Okay. Well, I know there are a lot of folks here in Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada that do use well water, and I've heard some pretty bad stories about people realizing that their well water is contaminated and not having access to fresh and clean water. And I know we talked a little bit before about how you got the idea to create the company, and I think you said you met some of your co-founders at a hackathon. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, so Aqua Action is a water initiative-focused organization out of Montreal or Quebec. And they have, I believe it's 3 different chapters of this competition. One of them is the Atlantic Canadian Aqua Hacking Challenge. And it's a 9-month challenge where they reveal a set of selected water problems, and you are in competition to develop solutions for those problems. And one of them was well water testing. And I had previously dabbled in water treatment and identified that water testing was likely the biggest bottleneck for the access to clean drinking water in Canada, and didn't yet know that was obviously the case for the rest of the world, but have learned that since.
Yes, I myself, I've traveled. We talked a little bit about you traveling kind of internationally. I know you lived in Australia and Norway and been a whole bunch of places. Myself, growing up, I also lived. My father was a medical doctor, and we lived in a variety of developing countries, in Thailand and the Ivory Coast, in West Africa. And access to clean water was a very important issue for health, well-being, all of those kinds of things.
It's surprising how few places in the world you can drink the tap water. I think very few people are aware of that haven't left. And it's actually one of the most interesting groups of people that we're now targeting on the marketing side, because most immigrants who come here, it takes them like 3 years to trust the tap water. One of our co-founders, Robert, who grew up in Ghana, still boils and then filters every single cup of water he drinks.
Oh, interesting.
And he's on Halifax Water Supply. So we're getting a lot of interest from people who, regardless of the logic behind it, the emotional anecdote from seeing people getting sick drinking tap water is ingrained in a lot of these people.
Yeah. Sometimes when my children start asking for all kinds of things and I get a little fed up with their privilege that they have, I tell them, you have no idea how lucky you are to live here in Canada. You have fresh air, clean water, and safety. Like, these are things that you just take for granted, and clean water is one of those things that they roll their eyes at me because they think, oh, you know. But I've been a lot of places where that is not the case. And, up north here in Canada and other places, it's not quite the same. And we do sort of take it for granted. Although I think every once in a while we get some boil water advisories here around Halifax with Halifax Water.
It presents an interesting problem for us because almost no investors grew up in those environments. The privilege that sets them up for success in their field often leaves them ignorant of the challenges that are faced around the world and even in rural environments here in Canada. So that's been one of the biggest challenges for us, is actually educating them in the process of the pitch.
Interesting. Then that's a really good point. So why don't you help some of our listeners who are tuning in, help us kind of understand, why is clean water important? Like, what makes it so difficult to get it in different places? I mean, I feel like people should know this, but as you said, like, if you've always grown up and always had clean water, you just sort of take it for granted. So why is clean water helpful? Why is it good to have?
Well, I think it's so elementary that it can often offend people to try and break down why it's so important. But it's part of literally everything. Like, it's part of the machines we rely on. It's part of the pharmaceutical industry we rely on, the medical system, our agricultural system, our heaters. Like, if the wrong water goes through the heating system, the machine breaks, we don't get heat. The petroleum industry for the energy that we very much take for granted. Everything. Soldiers on the ground who don't have access to clean drinking water, and then everyday people who very much rely on it to survive and to thrive. And yeah, I mentioned the statistic in the last episode, but clean drinking water or a lack of access to clean drinking water results in about 50% of the world's medical issues or hospital patients. And that is likely going to get a lot worse. Like, the trends are pointing in some very scary directions, and it's soon. It's like 2040, 2030, 2050 before we're facing completely different realities than now. And so these things, this water that's really important to us, that keeps our pharmaceutical industry turning, that keeps the lights on and the products we're used to flowing. For instance, there's a factory in Germany. It's a Tesla factory. They can't run it. It's too low in water. There's a pharmaceutical company in Texas, can't run. The water's too low. And that's going to become really normal, unfortunately, as there's more companies, more people, lower water levels, and the water complexity starts to increase because of the contamination. PFAS is another really interesting forever chemicals. It's in rainwater now. It's worrying levels in rainwater. So there's this precious thing that it's critical to everything we've gotten used to, including life itself. And it's at risk right now. So that's why water is important to me.
Yeah. No, I think, well, I appreciate you sharing that, because I do think it's, we have got water here on the table. And when you have clean drinking water and you don't really have to think about it, I mean, even near my house, I can see the water levels draining in a lake that's near me, near Williams Lake and other places. And I've been following the news a bit about communities, especially in South America, where in Peru and other places where it's the water levels are not there, or they're not getting enough rain, it's drought, and people have to move. So there's, migration patterns are also being affected as well, because people can't go back to the watering holes that they're used to or have been there for generations, and whole communities are moving, and it's impacting migration and, urbanization and things like that. So there are all of these downstream effects as well that we are very privileged here not to be too concerned about. So I appreciate you sharing some of that. And with drinkable, it's interesting because we talked you shared a little bit about the technology and what you're trying to do. And you have this device that allows people to easily kind of test their water. Do you feel like, is Drinkable a social purpose company, or is it just a regular business? Or like, do you think that you're trying to unlock social or economic value with your company?
I'm going to take a very roundabout way to answer this.
Okay.
I am someone that thinks the animal in humans is alive and well, and that needs to be respected and represents some hardwiring that should be worked with, not ignored or against. And it's very clear to me that humans at large like climbing hierarchies, like animals in nature. It's very important to our psyche to even try. We don't necessarily even have to succeed, but it's very rewarding to even see where you lie in a competence hierarchy of any discipline. Very rewarding. And I think that competence hierarchy is changing. I don't think we value just being a billionaire anymore. That's it's not very cool. It's kind of like, well, what did you do? That money represents literally millions of hours of human firepower, of getting things done. And if you're just launching cars into space with it, I don't think people are excited by that anymore. And a big part of it for me is there are people who are far more competitive than me, and that's saying something. And I would love to set an example of a hierarchy where you can utilize a profitable company to solve a world problem and get recognized for that. And I think that recognition is something that everybody's ultimately looking for, but might not know that hierarchy is there. And I think the success we've had at Drinkable, it's almost too much over the past year. I don't love seeing my face on a weekly or daily basis on LinkedIn by someone sharing a success story or something. That gets old pretty quick. And the fact that it's already old is kind of frightening me a bit. But I think that that's going to do wonders to show that that's how you achieve this thing that's really rewarding on an animal perspective. And it just feels good. It gets to scratch all the itches that we're after. It's we want responsibility. We want to be important to our communities. And I don't think there's a person on the planet that would prefer to be poor versus financially well off. So yeah, I think from a human perspective, that's the angle. But from a success perspective, the fastest and most effective way to do this quickly and responsibly, in my opinion, is to work with the private side of society, which is get a bunch of funding, maybe ignoring some of the roundtable discussions that would slow things down within government, and promise a return to investors that are willing to take a risk, model the company to fit their very specific investor needs. There are some human limitations to what companies can be and if they will be worth investment to investors. So just like we create a product specifically for a target persona, we're really making this for our specific individual that represents the proxy to our market. In the same way, we're collecting primary research on investors and trying to build the company as a product for them because they have a legal obligation to protect the money that they're investing from their LPs, their limited partners. So we're trying to make their job easier. And in so doing, we're making our jobs on the fundraising side a lot easier. So I think all the right rationale needs to be built into the structure of the company from the get-go. You can't wait to figure out what your culture is down the line and what your purpose is and what the whys are.
I love that. I think that's so important because it's a I don't want to say it's a lot easier to do at the beginning, but if the what do you call it? You put the cart before the horse. It's if it's out down the road and it's rambling down the road and you don't really have a good control over it, it'll get out of control. It's much harder to bring that back in, to bring in the culture, bring back in your strategy around how you're going to line up investment and those kinds of things. I know you had mentioned that you had some background looking at VC and being familiar with that, prior to founding Drinkable. How did that sort of impact how you decided to go about sort of creating the company?
It's huge. If I had just come to this with the environmental science perspective, I would have worked with the technologies that are currently available. I would have created a revenue-based company, grown very slowly, helped a small amount of people, probably had an easier life. But that isn't what needs to be done right now to solve problems at the pace that need to be solved. Because if we don't, the world we're going to be left with is a world that we're going to feel, I think, personally accountable for. So once I learned that venture capital was a faster way to get the fuel that's needed to solve this problem, not just for one group or one person, but could be applied elsewhere because of the scale. Yeah, very fundamental to the direction we went. And it was part of the night before the semifinals pitch of the Aqua Hacking Challenge. I reconfigured the business model and found like this is the business model that would attract investors. This is why we're doing this. This is now scalable. So from like literally day zero, that has been something that has been really important to me as a co-founder.
I think it's wise words that you've set out before us, and I hope that the entrepreneurs who are listening kind of take that to heart or think, say, oh, maybe this is something I need to consider, because I've known many technical founders who really love their technology and get so immersed in it, which is important. You need to have like good stuff.
That's the hierarchy they're climbing.
Yeah.
That's what they've been taught. They're in academia, and if they stay there too long, like that's the hierarchy that becomes rewarding. And sometimes we have to break out of our comfort zones and look at the big picture and the long term. Like you've got a life ahead of you. Do you want a stack of papers, or do you want to look back on a legacy of change?
Yeah. Well, how do you want to drive impact? Like where do you want to show up, and how do you want to drive that? So you've been out on the road, you've been pitching and trying to raise money for this company. And I don't know if you have much experience or perspective about this, but, do you feel that the landscape that's out there from a VC or angel perspective is a bit different for companies that are focused on sustainable technologies or climate adaptive technologies, or, things like that where I guess maybe Drinkable would fall into? Do you feel like that landscape is a bit different compared to maybe other, obviously, people making apps and, things like, I'm sure you have a component of that, but is that a bit different? What is that like?
I think it's more difficult. So it's easier to get non-dilutive as soon as you're trying to solve something that the government gets votes from helping to solve. Sorry to put it that way, but that's the reality of how things often work. But on the flip side, as soon as investors see that the drive for the solution is not scale, it's not a return on investment, like those sorts of things are often woven into sustainable companies. It's this like, I'm doing this because I was really sad one day and I didn't want to be sad. And I know that's an oversimplification, but that's how a lot of investors look at it. It's just like this, here's this person who's trying to feel good, but are they going to make difficult choices? And do they have the heart to be, frankly, as cold as you need to be sometimes? And it can be really hard, for instance, letting a co-founder go who was critical for the ideation stage, but that's all they want to do. They want to keep ideating. And when they might have had a significant chunk of the company, you're killing the company to not have those hard conversations. And I think a lot of investors are used to seeing some of those sustainable companies kind of lack that grittiness, that adherence to some of the stark realities of capitalism.
Having to make hard choices.
Yeah.
It's
competitive. So it's, I'm still friends with everyone really, but we had to let one of the co-founders go for that very reason. And that was incredibly challenging. It took months to build up the confidence to do that, to even hint at that. And, the first conversation is definitely the hardest.
Yeah.
But I think that's the sort of angle that a lot of investors look at a company and go, it's too soft, or it's likely to be too soft. And that I've had investors just not want to hear the rest of the pitch because they're like, oh, you're a social impact company. And it's like, I can also make you a lot of money. And I know that's what you care about. So let's keep talking.
Yeah. Did you see the market size here? Do you see the size of the problem? Yes. Yeah.
Exactly.
But that's no, I think that we've had other guests, or folks have talked about that as well. The ability to have those difficult conversations, especially if it's with a co-founder or something else, or make hard choices. And you talked, about some of the things that you witnessed with your own father having to, run his company and trying to scale it and get it to the level it needs to be. So I imagine it's, with social purpose companies as well, or, trying to solve some of these problems, even though they can make money, there's always maybe, it sounds like there's a bias maybe from VCs or things like that you might be too soft-hearted to make the hard choices.
Well, I think a good example of the perspectives a lot of the top investors take, Andreessen Horowitz, which is like one of the premium investment groups, like crazy deep pockets. It is part of their policy to pick founders who are egotistical. Like they're looking for what was the word? Megalomaniac or something.
A narcissist or something.
Basically, because we've synthesized why that's important into the company. but they think they can succeed at everything. And so they aim for the top of the big mountain, and you need to be at the top of the big mountain to get the returns you need as a VC, because a single success can pay off the entire fund, and most of the companies are ultimately failures aiming that high. So we've taken a mathematical approach to that and said, okay, what's the risk we need to take? And we understand that like a solution like this doesn't get to the world unless we aim really high for all of those reasons. So we've been able to synthesize that, but ultimately it's really important that you aim high.
Well, it's an interesting kind of conundrum, because you think about a company like a Uber or something like that, where they've grown, it's scaled, everybody's super excited about them, but internally their culture, they've been like hammered, relentlessly, at the same time. We've seen a lot of cases like that sort of more recently. So, on the one hand, you want to have that founder who's going to drive, think big, do the big things. But on the other hand, if you do all of that and you don't have the other supports, the culture, the other things, it can burn you at the other end as well. So there's a bit of a balance, and it sounds like you guys have thought about that and trying to navigate that to make it work for you. Well, I know one thing that we also talked about was this idea, and I really loved it in some of our earlier conversations, but this idea around empowering people with technology. And I know that's something that you're pretty passionate about with Drinkable. Can you talk a little bit about how you feel that, your technology and what you're making at Drinkable is empowering people?
I think like a good way to put it is that water literacy is really low everywhere. And this is a tool that'll essentially read it out loud for you. And coming back to that statistic where like half of hospitalizations are due to just not knowing what's in the water, obviously that's empowering. If you're from a community where like you don't make it past the age of 50, or you see someone in the community like regularly dying of diseases that can be attributed to a local contaminant of some kind, knowing on that day, week, month, part of the year in the dry season that you should be going to a different well, boiling the water, running it through a filter, that to me is empowerment. And I think in the Syrian refugee crisis, as an example, you had like a 5-year drought around the city, and a lot of people not able to manage the safety of their family, probably seeing their kids get sick on a regular basis. And at some point they said, I'm going to give up everything and walk to a city nearby. And it completely devastated the local infrastructure because the water resources they had there could not support the ballooning population. So it caused the entire city to collapse. And I think that's a warning for the future. Like, that's going to happen everywhere. And in a lot of cases, the government isn't going to be the person that gets you clean drinking water. And so I view this as adaptive climate technology, because it will empower people to find another puddle if they need to find another puddle. Don't drink that one, drink something else. And, maybe weigh up, I'd rather drink arsenic than a lot of bacteria. Like, those are challenges we don't face here, but that may be something that is required to help a very changing landscape over the next 30 years. Yeah, that's, gosh, I just got this really heavy feeling. Unfortunately, I think it's due.
Yeah, because as we said, we're very lucky here. We can just, we're having tea and things like that. But, people are on the move, and you may need to make a decision about what pathogen am I willing to ingest, because the human body cannot exist without water. Is it 3 days? I think you can survive without water. But anyway, it's either way, so we're talking about, some communities just, needing for healthy well water. But, in other cases, there could be groups of migrants or in a refugee camp or, other places where the water resources really, really, really stretch thin. And
maybe in a lot of situations, they wouldn't be a refugee if they could have managed their environment better, not had this feeling like I'm letting my kids down. Oh, I can stay here. And like, we've got 4 different water sources. And as long as I can juggle in between them, we get to stay here. And I can continue the community and the culture that we've built up over many generations in this one spot. That's a lot to give up. That would be enormously devastating to not be able to manage your own essentials. So again, that's where the autonomy comes in.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing your perspective today around why water is so important, why it's important to you. what Drinkable is trying to do and create opportunities for people to have the information, the knowledge, and empower themselves around the decisions that they make when they are testing water and seeking water. And I hope that folks will take heed to that. Any last parting words you'd like to share? I do have one more question, which is our typical onside question that I'd love to ask you. But any parting thoughts kind of on climate emergency, climate change, where we're going with that that's on your mind?
There's a lot to say.
Or a call to action that you think would be useful for people to consider.
I think I have a very centrist perspective on a lot of topics. And this is one where I feel like I can understand why a lot of people on one side would prefer to believe that the climate situation isn't as dire as it really is. And I would encourage everyone to reconsider the narratives that make the world comfortable enough to not be stressed in and to allow the stress to be present. Because without that stress, we're not going to be motivated to make the choices that we need to make to mitigate a lot of what's coming. And ultimately, you're going to thank yourself for doing that. So just ask yourself the hard questions, regardless of which side of the fence you land on, and find a way to be part of a brighter future as opposed to a stagnant one.
Okay. I like that. Okay. I have one final question. Love to ask all of our guests about this. And that is really just around innovation-driven entrepreneurship. What does that mean to you?
Using anything new to improve access to something somebody else wants or needs. Whether that's a service, if that's a car, if that's water, if that's helping someone, I don't know, give birth. Those are all pretty great things. So if you can make them better, then I think you're an entrepreneur. If you're making money in the process. If you're doing it for free, then you're just a saint.
Okay.
But I think the innovation side doesn't necessarily even have to be technology. But as long as you're blending maybe two old things together or optimizing something that came before, if you're fixing something, if you're making something new, I think you're an innovator.
Okay. I love it. And if folks want to know more about Drinkable, how can they find more information about Drinkable?
I would love if more people learned about Drinkable. So you can go to www.drinkable.tech, TECH. We do have pre-orders open for our version 1, which hopefully we can launch fall next year or late summer next year. And yeah, if you have any questions, please email us at the email that can be found on our website, info@drinkable.tech.
Okay, that sounds great. I appreciate having you here on the show, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. It's been great.
Yeah. And for folks who want to learn more about Onside, you can, of course, subscribe to our podcast. Please do that. And you can check out our website, which is onsidenow.ca. Lots of great information about our Inclusive Innovation Monitor. And as we come to a close, I'd like to also thank Community, Culture, and Heritage. We're so grateful for your support in helping us make this podcast. And stay tuned for our next episodes. It'll be out soon. Thanks.
This has been a Podstarter production.